The old Chevy pickup crawled through the endless pine's headlights, carving pale tunnels through the falling snow. Montana's late November sky hung low and gray heavy with the kind of silence that only exists in forgotten places. Inside the cab, Mason Winters gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him steady. 3 years. 3 long years since his mother's funeral, and this was the first time he'd had the courage to return. 8-year-old Ethan dozed in the middle seat, his small head nodding with each bump in the road while clutching a leather-bound photo album to his chest. The boy had never met his grandmother Eleanor, but he'd insisted on bringing the album a connection to family history he'd never known. Ranger sat alert by the passenger window, thick coat dusted with snowflakes, amber eyes fixed ahead. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound from the forest, his military training evident in his posture. Every rut in the frozen road made the old truck groan. The heater barely worked, and Mason could see his breath fogging the windshield. He reached out, gave the dashboard a small tap. "Almost there, buddy." Ranger's low whine vibrated through the cold air, his gaze never leaving the road ahead. When the trees finally broke, the cabin appeared like a memory trying to claw its way out of the past. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the porch railing leaned outwards, surrendering to time and weather. The same wind chime his mother had hung years ago still swayed, trembling notes barely audible through the storm. Mason cut the engine. For a long minute, none of them moved. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling motor and the sigh of the forest. His hand hovered over the door handle, heart hammering against his ribs. The last time he'd stood on this land, he'd been holding an urn. Now he was returning with a son who asked too many questions about family he'd never met, and debts that seemed to multiply with each passing month. Since Diane's death 18 months ago, everything had spiraled: medical bills, the mortgage, and finally the foreclosure notice. This cabin, this place he'd avoided for years, had become their last refuge. Ethan stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is that it? Is that Grandma Eleanor's house?" His voice small and curious. No hint of the disappointment Mason felt looking at the weathered structure. Mason nodded, throat too tight for words. The boy pressed his face against the window, breath creating circles of fog. "It's like in her pictures, but older." Snow crunched beneath their boots as they stepped out. Ranger followed close, tail stiff, nose testing the air. The smell of pine and old smoke hung around the cabin. It was smaller than Mason remembered. Maybe he'd just grown larger, older, harder. His hand instinctively touched the scar running along his jawline, Iraq's parting gift. Mason reached the porch, boots heavy on the weathered planks, and found the key his mother had always kept under the third step. When he slid it into the rusted lock, it resisted the metal grinding with stubborn age. It turned at last with a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. Ranger's fur bristled, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Mason looked down at his companion. "Easy, boy, it's just us." But Ranger didn't relax. His ears pinned forward, eyes locked on the shadowed doorway. He gave a short bark, sharp and warning, just like he had in Fallujah when something wasn't right. Mason swallowed hard, throat dry, and placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The door swung open with a reluctant creak. The smell hit them, first dust and wood rot, the air thick and stale. Light from outside spilled across the floor, revealing footprints Mason had made 3 years ago when he'd carried in boxes from the hospital. Every surface was covered in a thin layer of gray. His mother's rocking chair sat by the window, frozen mid-motion. A folded blanket draped over the armrest, as if she'd only stepped away for a minute. Ethan slipped from his grasp and stepped inside his small boots, leaving fresh prints in the dust. His eyes darted everywhere, taking in the cabin with curious wonder. "This is where Grandma lived." "All by herself," Mason nodded, following his son inside. Memories flooded back, running across the same floor. As a boy, his mother calling after him to slow down. The smell of her cornbread, the sound of her humming old country songs, while the radio crackled in the background. Now there was only the whisper of the wind slipping through cracked window panes. Ranger padded in behind them, sniffing every corner with professional diligence. When the dog stopped suddenly staring down the dark hallway that led to the bedrooms, Mason felt that familiar chill crawl up his spine. The shadows back there seemed deeper than they should be. Turning on the old generators took nearly an hour. The cabin gradually came to life, dim lights flickering, the ancient furnace groaning to a start. Ethan explored every corner, asking endless questions about his grandmother. Did she like puzzles? Did she know how to make pancakes? Why did she live so far away from everyone? Mason answered what he could, omitting the complicated parts. How Eleanor had grown distant after William disappeared. How she'd retreated to this cabin. How Mason had stopped visiting long before she got sick. As Mason unloaded their meager belongings from the truck, a folded paper fell from the mailbox, a property tax delinquency notice dated 3 years ago, warning of foreclosure proceedings. His stomach twisted. The place he'd thought was his mother's, pride free and clear, had been under financial threat. She'd never said a word, never asked for help. Night settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. After a simple dinner of canned soup warmed on the old stove, Mason tucked Ethan into the small room that had once been his own. The boy's fingers traced the faded baseball posters still taped to the walls. "Was this your room when you were little?" Mason nodded, smoothing the quilted blanket over his son. "That's right. I was a little older than you when we moved here. What about Grandpa? Where did he go?" Ethan's innocent question landed like a physical blow. The same question Mason had asked for years after William Reed vanished into these woods when Mason was 10. The official story was an accident while cutting timber, but they never found a body. Just an abandoned truck and a cold trail. "He's gone, buddy. A long time ago." Mason's voice was gentle but final. "Try to get some sleep. We've got a lot of work to do tomorrow." Ranger settled on the floor beside Ethan's bed, his protective instinct automatically shifting to the smallest member of their pack. Mason left the door cracked and walked to his mother's bedroom. Heart heavy with each step. Her room remained untouched, bed neatly made rosary hanging from the headboard, sunlight-faded curtains stirring in the draft. The small desk in the corner still held her old radio, the kind with the wood paneling and brass dials. Dust coated the top, but someone, maybe Mason years ago, had wiped a small circle clean around the power knob. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, and the springs sighed beneath him. "You'd laugh if you saw me now, Mom." Still trying to hold it together. A metallic glint caught his eye, a small tin box on the nightstand he hadn't noticed before. The edges were rusted, but the army green paint was unmistakable. With careful fingers, he pried open the lid. Inside lay a folded note written in his mother's looping script, the ink slightly faded with age. "If you found this, Mason, it means you finally came home. Don't ignore what Ranger tries to show you. He remembers more than you think." Mason read the words twice, confusion creasing his brow. How could his mother have known about Ranger? The dog had come into his life years after her death, assigned to him during his second tour in Iraq. It made no sense. Unless a soft thump from the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Mason stepped out to find Ranger standing alertly at the end of the corridor, staring at the ceiling. The dog's ears were pricked, forward his body tense. Mason followed his gaze to the attic hatch above it, was slightly ajar, though Mason could have sworn it had been closed when they arrived. Before he could investigate, a small voice called from the bedroom. "Dad, there's a weird noise in my room." Mason found Ethan sitting up in bed, eyes wide. "Something's in the wall. It sounds like scratching." Mason pressed his ear against the faded wallpaper. Sure enough, a faint scratching sound emanated from within, probably mice or squirrels that had taken up residence. He reassured Ethan, promising to check the walls in the morning, and stayed until the boy drifted back to sleep. But Ranger wouldn't settle. The dog paced the hallway, returning again and again to stare at one section of flooring near the guest room. Finally, Mason knelt beside him, running a hand through the Marnie's thick fur. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" Ranger pawed at the floorboards, nails catching on the edge of one that seemed slightly different from the others, a shade darker, newer. Mason tapped it with his knuckles, hearing the hollow sound beneath. His mother's note echoed in his mind. "Don't ignore what Ranger tries to show you." Using a pocket knife, Mason pried up the board. The space beneath was shallow but deliberate, lined with faded canvas. Inside sat a small metal box wrapped in wax paper. His pulse quickened as he unwrapped it. Dog tags clinked against his palm, not his own but his father's. William Reed, 03 U.S. Army Engineers. Beside them lay a photograph curled at the edges. His father and mother standing in front of this very cabin, much younger, his father in uniform. When Mason turned it over, he found his mother's handwriting again. "For when he's ready to forgive." Forgive who? His father, for leaving himself, for never asking why. Mason stared at the tags for a long time, memories washing over him. Everyone had said William went out one winter to cut timber and never came back. The sheriff called it an accident. Mason had believed that until the years went by and his mother's silence about it grew too careful, too practiced. A sudden bark from Ranger broke his reverie. The dog was at the front door, hackles raised. Mason tucked the tags and photo into his pocket and moved cautiously toward the entrance. Through the small window, he saw headlights cutting through the darkness, a black SUV pulling up to the cabin, its engine purring expensively in the night. Mason's hand moved instinctively to his hip, where his service weapon would have been. Old habits. Instead, he flicked off the porch light and waited as a tall figure emerged from the vehicle. The man wore an expensive coat, his breath clouding in the cold air as he approached. Two others remained by the SUV, their stances suggesting they weren't just drivers. When the knock came, it was sharp and confident, three precise raps that seemed to echo through the cabin. Mason opened the door, halfway blocking the entrance, with his body keeping Ranger behind him, despite the dog's growls. "Good evening, Mr. Winters." The stranger's voice was smooth, practiced. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize for the late visit, but I understand you've recently arrived. Victor Blackwood, Meridian Dynamics." The man extended a manicured hand, which Mason did not take. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" Mason's voice was neutral, but his body remained tensed, ready. Victor lowered his hand, still smiling. "I represent a development group interested in properties in this valley. Your mother and I had several discussions before her passing." His gaze swept past Mason into the cabin. "I understand you're facing some financial difficulties. The property tax situation, for instance." "How do you know about that?" Mason's jaw tightened. "That information isn't public." Victor's smile widened slightly. "We make it our business to know the properties we're interested in. My company is prepared to offer you double the appraised value for this land. Cash settlement immediate. You and your son could start fresh somewhere more convenient." The mention of Ethan sent a cold spike through Mason's chest. How did this man know about his son? They'd only arrived hours ago. "I'm not selling." Mason's tone left no room for negotiation. Victor studied him for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. He produced a business card and held it out. "Think about it, Mr. Winters. Montana winters are harsh. Roofs cave in. Accidents happen." The words hung in the air between them, neither threat nor warning, but something in between. Mason didn't take the card, so Victor placed it on the porch railing. His smile never faltered as he turned and walked back to the SUV. Mason watched until the taillights disappeared into the darkness, then closed and locked the door. Ranger's growl had subsided to a low rumble in his chest. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the door, as if he could still see the threat beyond it. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He sat in his mother's rocking chair by the window, the dog tags cool in his palm, his father's face staring up at him from the faded photograph. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing Victor Blackwood's footprints as if he'd never been there at all. But the business card remained on the railing, a small white rectangle against the weathered wood. Morning brought pale sunshine and a momentary peace. Ethan's excitement at exploring the property overrode Mason's concerns about their midnight visitor. The boy raced around the yard, Ranger loping beside him, both leaving chaotic patterns in the fresh snow. For a brief moment, Mason could almost pretend they were just here for a vacation, not because they had nowhere else to go. After breakfast, Mason climbed to the attic, wanting to check the hatch that had been ajar the night before. The ladder creaked under his weight, protesting years of disuse. The attic stretched low and wide, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten furniture. Sunlight filtered through a small window, illuminating dancing dust motes. Against the far wall stood an old military footlocker, painted army green, identical to the small box he'd found in his mother's room. Mason crossed the floor each step, stirring dust like smoke. The footlocker's brass latch was tarnished but intact. When he opened it, the hinges groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Inside, layers of his parents' past were packed tight military jackets, folded with precision field manuals yellowed with age, and a leather-bound notebook with his mother's name written on the cover. Eleanor Reed, RN, 1972, with the faded insignia of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Mason lifted the notebook, its leather cover cool against his fingers. The first pages contained neat handwriting filled with clinical details and ration lists from her deployment in Vietnam. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. Less military, more human. Some wounds don't bleed, one line read, and they don't heal with stitches either. She wrote about field hospitals, helicopters, and men younger than she was begging for their mothers. About a soldier who never stopped apologizing as he died, saying he'd seen too much to ever be clean again. The words seemed to reach across decades straight into Mason's chest. War stains everything he thought, even those who only tried to heal others. Deeper in the footlocker, Mason found another folder marked Project Echo in military stenciling. The pages inside described a research initiative involving neural pattern preservation and memory retention systems. Medical terminology mixed with engineering diagrams that Mason couldn't fully understand. His father's name appeared repeatedly, lead engineer W. Reed. According to the documents, Project Echo had been designed to record and preserve the memories of soldiers, especially those who might not make it home. A way to ensure no experience, no knowledge is lost. One passage read, but something had gone wrong. Later entries showed growing concerns, notes about unexpected consciousness echoes, and ethical implications beyond original scope. The last page was a letter from William to Eleanor, dated 1986, the year before his father vanished. Elle, if you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to tell you in person. I've done things I can't take back. I keep seeing their faces in the trees when I close my eyes. Maybe that's punishment enough. I built something out here in the woods, a place I thought might keep the ghosts quiet. But the quiet doesn't help. If Mason ever asks about me, tell him I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. Tell him not to look for me. Mason sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. The man he'd spent a lifetime resenting hadn't run from family. He'd run from himself. A shout from outside jolted him back to the present. Dad, come quick. Ranger found something. Mason scrambled down the ladder to find Ethan bouncing with excitement on the porch pointing toward the tree line. Ranger stood at the edge of the forest barking insistently. Mason followed his son outside, the cold air biting at his face after the stuffiness of the attic. Ranger led them past the old well through a dense section of pines to a fallen tree, partially covered with snow. The dog began pawing at the ground near its roots, whining with urgency. Mason knelt and brushed away snow until the edge of something solid emerged. Wood old and damp. A plank. Beneath it, faintly visible, was a corner of a structure buried under earth and leaves. He crouched lower, clearing more snow, to reveal what looked like a small hatch built into the hillside. Vines had grown around its edges, camouflaging it from casual observation. What is it, Dad? Ethan crouched beside him, eyes wide with curiosity. I'm not sure, buddy. Some kind of storage, maybe. Mason brushed off a small brass plate nailed above the entrance. The engraving had worn away, but he could still make out the letters W. Reed, 1986. Mason felt a cold rush through him that had nothing to do with the weather. His father had built this place the year before he disappeared, the something in the woods mentioned in his letter. The hatch resisted at first years of forest growth, sealing it shut. But with both of them pulling, it finally gave way with a groan of protesting metal. Cold, stale air wafted out, carrying the scent of damp earth, and something else, oil and old paper. Ranger sniffed cautiously at the entrance, ears alert, but not showing the alarm he'd displayed at the cabin. It's like a secret fort, Ethan whispered, peering into the darkness. Mason pulled out his flashlight. Wait here with Ranger. Let me check if it's safe. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small room dug into the hillside. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a bunker reinforced with timber and metal sheeting. Old tools hung on the walls, and a cot lay in one corner covered in a layer of dust. A desk stood against the far wall. Paper still scattered across its surface as if its occupant had just stepped out. Mason moved deeper inside the flashlight beam, trembling slightly in his grip. On the desk sat a single envelope addressed simply to my son. His throat tightened as he picked it up, recognizing his father's handwriting, ours from the documents in the attic. The letter inside was brief, the handwriting less steady than in the military reports. Mason, if you find this, then I didn't make it back. There are things buried deeper here than roots. Don't trust anyone who comes asking about the land. They're not here for timber. They're here for what's underneath. Beneath the letter was a map drawn on yellowed paper, hand-sketched outlines of the property marked with symbols Mason didn't recognize. Various locations were circled and annotated with cryptic notations: E2 access, relay point, primary storage. At the bottom, a single word was underlined twice: echo. Mason folded the map and slipped it into his pocket alongside the dog tags. His mind raced trying to connect the fragments: Project Echo, his father's work with the Army engineers, his disappearance, and now Victor Blackwood's sudden interest in the property. Whatever his father had been involved in hadn't ended with his disappearance. It was still here, buried beneath the land. A sharp bark from Ranger pulled Mason back to the entrance. The dog stood alert, staring into the forest, hackles raised. Mason emerged from the bunker to find Ethan looking frightened. "Dad, there's people in the woods." "Over there." The boy pointed toward a ridge about 100 yards away. Mason scanned the tree line, catching a flash of movement, dark figures moving with purpose, too deliberate to be hikers. In the distance, the faint hum of engines carried through the still air. "Get behind me." Mason pulled Ethan close as Ranger positioned himself in front of them, both a low growl rumbling in his chest. Through the trees, Mason glimpsed the same black SUV from the previous night, now joined by a second vehicle. They were parked on the service road that ran along the property's edge. Several men in dark clothing moved through the forest, sweeping the area in a search pattern that was military in its precision. "We need to get back to the cabin." Mason's voice was calm but urgent. He quickly pulled the hatch closed and covered it with snow and branches, obscuring it from view. Keeping to the densest part of the forest, Mason led Ethan and Ranger on a circuitous route back toward the cabin. They moved quietly, Mason's combat training taking over as he chose their path, carefully avoiding open areas and staying downwind. As they approached the clearing around the cabin, Mason heard voices. Crouching behind a fallen log, he peered through the branches to see Victor Blackwood standing on the porch, speaking with two men in tactical gear. Their conversation drifted across the clearing. "I want every inch of this property surveyed before nightfall. If Reed's notes were accurate, the access point should be within half a mile of the main structure." Victor's voice was different now, harder, more commanding than the smooth businessman from the night before. "And if the sun becomes a problem," one of the men asked, his hand resting on what Mason recognized as a holstered sidearm. Victor's response chilled Mason to the bone. "Accidents happen in these mountains all the time. A tragic case of wrong place, wrong time. But the boy isn't to be harmed." "Clear." The men nodded and moved off to join others emerging from the woods. Mason counted at least 6 of them now, all with the bearing and equipment of professional security or ex-military. This wasn't a development company looking for property. This was a tactical operation. Mason pulled Ethan closer, feeling the boy trembling against him. "What do they want, Dad?" "I don't know, buddy, but we need to get somewhere safe." Mason's mind raced through their options. The cabin was compromised. They couldn't make it to the truck without being seen. The nearest neighbor, according to his mother's old letters, was Martha Lawson, about 2 miles down the mountain. If they could reach her place, they could call for help. A sharp crack from the direction of the cabin made them all freeze. Smoke began to rise from the old barn near the house. One of Victor's men stood nearby, something bright burning in his hand. With a casual flick, he tossed it onto the barn's roof. Flames licked upward, catching quickly on the dry, aged wood. "They're burning it, Dad." Ethan's voice broke with distress. Mason watched in horror as the fire spread rapidly. The barn had stood for generations, built by his grandfather. Now it was being destroyed to send a message or to cover something up. "This way." Mason directed Ethan deeper into the forest, away from the cabin, and toward the old logging road that would eventually lead to Martha Lawson's property. Ranger took point, his military training evident in the way he moved, alert, silent, stopping occasionally to listen before proceeding. They hiked for nearly an hour, moving as quickly as they dared through the snowy terrain. Ethan kept pace without complaint, though Mason could see exhaustion setting in. The boy had never experienced anything like this, the sudden flight, the looming threat. It was too much like Mason's time overseas, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that danger could appear at any moment. As they crested a ridge, a small cabin came into view below, smoke curling from its chimney, a weathered pickup parked outside. Martha Lawson's place, according to his mother's descriptions. Relief washed over Mason. The elderly woman who answered their knock seemed unsurprised to see them. Martha Lawson's face was lined but kind, her blue eyes bright despite her 70-plus years. "Well, if it isn't little Mason Winters, I was wondering when you'd find your way back. Her gaze shifted to Ethan, then to Ranger. And you've brought company. She ushered them inside without waiting for explanations. The cabin was small but warm, every surface covered with books, plants, or curious objects collected over a lifetime. A wood stove crackled in the corner, filling the space with gentle heat. Men came to the cabin, Mason explained once they were seated with mugs of hot chocolate. They're looking for something on our land. They burned the barn. Martha's face grew serious. She sat heavily in an old armchair across from them. I was afraid of this. Your mother warned me they might come back after she was gone. You knew my mother. Mason couldn't hide his surprise. Martha nodded, her eyes distant with memory. Eleanor and I go back 50 years, all the way to nursing school. I followed her into the Army Medical Corps, though I got out sooner than she did. When she moved up here with William, I followed a few years later. These mountains have a way of calling to certain souls. She looked at Mason directly, her expression grave. Your mother was worried the last few years of her life. Said there were people interested in the land, but not for the reasons they claimed. Something William had been involved with during his time with the engineers. Something buried, Project Echo, Mason said quietly. Martha's eyes widened slightly. So you know about that. I found some documents, my father's notes. Mason pulled out the map from the bunker. But I don't understand what it means. What were they working on? Martha glanced at Ethan, who was sitting on the floor with Ranger, the boy's attention divided between the adult's conversation and the dog's comforting presence. Some things aren't for young ears, she said softly. Let him rest a while. We can talk after. She showed Ethan to a small guest room where the boy, exhausted from their ordeal, quickly fell asleep with Ranger curled protectively beside the bed. When Martha returned, her expression had hardened. Project Echo wasn't just another military research initiative, she began, her voice low. It started as a way to record the experiences of soldiers, their memories, their knowledge, so it wouldn't be lost if they didn't make it home. William was brilliant with the technical side, and Eleanor understood the human element, the mind, the nervous system. Martha poured herself a small glass of amber liquid and took a sip before continuing. But something happened during the testing phases. The technology didn't just record memories, it created what William called echoes of consciousness. Fragments of personality, emotion, even awareness that somehow persisted in the system. When they realized what was happening, William wanted to shut it down. But the military saw potential. Imagine being able to preserve the minds of their best strategists, their most skilled operators, maybe even transplant those memories into new recruits. She shook her head slowly. Your father couldn't let that happen. He took key components, research, everything he could, and disappeared. The official story was an accident in the woods, but those of us who knew, we understood. And my mother, Mason asked, his voice tight. Did she know all this? Martha's eyes softened with sympathy. Eleanor protected William's secret for years. She made sure the property stayed in her name, kept up just enough appearance of normalcy to avoid suspicion. When these Meridian people started showing up a few years ago, she refused to sell despite the financial strain. She knew what they were really after. A cold realization settled over Mason. That's why she never asked for help with the taxes. She didn't want to explain why the land was so important. Martha nodded. She was stubborn that way. Wouldn't burden you with it. Said you'd had enough war for one lifetime. Mason stared down at his father's map, seeing it with new understanding. The symbols, the notations, they weren't just random markings. They were locations of components, access points to whatever system his father had built. And Meridian Dynamics wanted it badly enough to threaten his family. I need to call the sheriff. Get some official help, Mason said. Martha's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Davies. He's in Victor Blackwood's pocket. Has been for years. Those companies don't come to remote places like this without making sure local authorities look the other way. She leaned forward, her voice dropping further. But Deputy Jack Reynolds is different. He was friends with your mother. If anyone will help, it's him. Mason used Martha's landline to call the deputy, explaining the situation as best he could without sounding completely unhinged. To his relief, Jack Reynolds didn't dismiss his concerns. I've had my eye on those Meridian folks for a while now, the deputy said. Too many resources for a simple development company. Give me a couple of hours to check some things, then I'll head your way. Night fell, bringing with it a sense of temporary safety in Martha's cabin. Ethan woke from his nap, more himself curious about their new surroundings and the elderly woman who seemed to know so much about his grandmother. Martha delighted the boy with stories about Eleanor's younger days, her stubbornness, her kindness, her skill as a healer. It was long past midnight when Mason jolted awake from a fitful sleep on Martha's couch. Something had woken him, a sound of presence. Ranger stood at the window, his posture alert but not alarmed. The dog's tail wagged once in recognition. Mason moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. A figure stood at the edge of Martha's property, barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the clouds. For an instant, Mason thought it might be one of Blackwood's men, but Ranger's relaxed demeanor suggested otherwise. The figure raised a hand in greeting, then turned and walked into the forest. Something about the silhouette, the square shoulders, the deliberate gait tugged at Mason's memory. It couldn't be. His father had been gone for over 20 years. A soft voice behind him made him turn. Ethan stood in the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Dad, I had a dream about Grandpa. He was trying to show me something important." Mason knelt before his son, hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "What was he showing you, buddy?" Ethan's brow furrowed with concentration. "A place under the ground, with blue lights. He said it's the heart of Echo, and we need to find it before the bad men do." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. How could Ethan dream of things he couldn't possibly know? The boy had never seen a photograph of William until yesterday, never heard stories about Project Echo. As if in answer, his mother's note echoed in his mind. "Don't ignore what Ranger tries to show you. He remembers more than you think." Mason looked at the German shepherd still watching the window, then back at his son. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of engines broke the night's silence. Despite the fire, despite their escape, Blackwood's men hadn't given up. Whatever Project Echo had been, whatever it had become, the hunt for it was just beginning. And Mason realized with cold certainty that he couldn't run from this. His father had tried that approach, disappearing into these very mountains, and the past had found him anyway. Now it had found Mason and Ethan too. The only way forward was through to discover what lay buried beneath the Winters property and why men with guns were willing to kill for it. As the engines grew louder, Mason made his decision. They would need to return to the cabin to follow his father's map to the heart of Echo. Not just to protect themselves, but to finish what William had started all those years ago. He gathered Ethan close, feeling the boy's small heart beating against his own. "I'll keep you safe, buddy. I promise." Some promises couldn't be kept. Mason had learned that lesson too well in Iraq. But this one he would die trying to honor. The first pale light of dawn was breaking over the mountains when Deputy Jack Reynolds finally arrived. The man's weathered face was grim as he stepped into Martha's cabin, removing his hat respectfully. "I did some digging on Meridian Dynamics," he said without preamble. "They're not in any business registry I could find. But there's a defense contractor by the same acronym, Regional Echo Development. They were Army Corps subcontractors back in the 70s, specialized in decommissioned testing sites." Mason felt the pieces clicking into place. "Like the one under our land," Jack nodded slowly. "One of their listed projects, Echo 02, matches a code I found in an old Army archive. Full name, Echo Neural Preservation Initiative." And Mason, he hesitated, his eyes troubled. "I pulled the report on your father's disappearance. It wasn't just the local search and rescue that looked for him. There was a military unit involved. Officially, they were assisting, but reading between the lines. They weren't looking for a missing person," Mason finished. "They were looking for what he took." Jack's grim nod confirmed it. "Whatever your father was involved in, it didn't end when he disappeared. And now it's found its way back to you." Mason spread his father's map on Martha's kitchen table. The property lines were clearly marked, but it was the annotations that drew their attention, tunnels and access points, spanning the hillside, all converging on a central location marked simply as Primary Hub. "If I'm reading this correctly," Mason said, "there's an entire facility beneath our property. Not just the bunker we found, but something much larger." Martha leaned over the map, her finger tracing one of the lines. "This matches old mining surveys from the 1930s. The Army often repurposed those tunnels for their projects, saved them the trouble of new excavation." Jack studied the map with a professional eye. "This is why Blackwood wants the land. Whatever's down there, it's worth more than timber rights." A small voice broke into their conversation. Ethan stood in the doorway, Ranger at his side. The heart of Echo is underneath the old well, he said with childlike certainty. Grandpa showed me. The adults exchanged glances, but Mason had stopped questioning his son's dreams. Too much had happened that defied rational explanation. If Ethan said the heart of Echo was under the well, that's where they would look. I'm coming with you, Jack said when Mason announced his intention to return to the cabin. Safety in numbers. Besides, he added, patting his service weapon, I'm not just bringing my good looks to this fight. Martha insisted on staying behind with Ethan. The boy protested until Mason knelt before him, hands firm on his shoulders. I need you to stay here and protect Martha, buddy. This is a job for grown-ups. Ranger will stay with you. But Ranger shook off that plan, immediately planting himself firmly at Mason's side, his intention clear. The dog was going where Mason went, just as he had in Iraq. Finally, they compromised that Ethan would stay with Martha and Jack's deputy friend would check in on them regularly. As Mason prepared to leave, Martha pressed something into his hand, a small wooden box with intricate carvings. Eleanor gave me this for safekeeping, she said. Said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you got it. I think now's the time. Inside the box lay a small key and a faded photograph of Eleanor and William standing before what looked like a military installation, arms around each other, young and confident. On the back, written in his mother's handwriting, Project Echo, 1974, the beginning. Mason slipped the key into his pocket alongside his father's dog tags. Whatever doors it opened, whatever secrets it revealed, he was ready to face them. He had spent too long running from his past, his father's disappearance, his mother's silence, his own wartime ghosts. Now those threads were pulling tight, drawing him back to where it all began. As they drove toward the cabin, Mason watched the Montana landscape roll by, the endless pines, the snow-capped peaks, the clear blue sky that seemed to go on forever. This land had held his family's secrets for decades. Today, it would finally give them up. The smoke from the barn was still visible as they approached a dark smudge against the horizon. Mason's chest tightened at the sight. The barn had been part of his childhood, a place of adventure and imagination. Now it was just another casualty in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Jack parked his patrol truck a quarter mile from the property, hidden among the trees. They would approach on foot using the forest cover. No sign of Blackwood's vehicles, but Mason didn't trust the apparent calm. Men like Victor didn't give up easily, especially when stakes were high. They moved through the trees in silence, Jack's police training complementing Mason's military experience. Ranger took point, his senses sharper than either man's, leading them on a path that avoided open spaces and maintained maximum cover. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Mason felt a surge of anger. The barn was a blackened skeleton, smoke still rising from its ruins. The cabin appeared untouched, but Mason could see signs of forced entry, the front door slightly ajar, window curtains disturbed. They're gone for now, Jack murmured, scanning the property with the binoculars. But they'll be back. People don't burn down buildings, then just walk away. The well was on the far side of the property, past the cabin and near the tree line. Getting there would mean crossing open ground, a risk if Blackwood had left anyone behind to watch the property. Ranger suddenly tensed, a low growl vibrating in his chest. A moment later, Mason heard it too. Engine still distant, but approaching. Blackwood's men were returning. We need to move. Now. Mason's voice was tight with urgency. If that well is what my father's map indicates, we can't let them find it first. They sprinted across the open ground, abandoning stealth for speed. The well loomed ahead, at old stonework covered in moss, its wooden roof long rotted away. Martha had mentioned that Eleanor sealed it years ago after Mason left for the military, claiming the water had gone bad. Sure enough, heavy planks were nailed across the top, the wood weathered but solid. Mason and Jack pried at the boards with a crowbar from Jack's truck. Ranger keeping watch, his ears perked toward the sound of approaching vehicles. The last plank gave way with a crack that seemed too loud in the stillness. Below was not water, but a shaft lined with metal rungs leading into darkness. A maintenance access, just as William's map had indicated. The rumble of engines grew louder. Blackwood's men were almost upon them. Jack pulled out his service weapon, face grim. I'll buy you some time. Find whatever's down there and figure out how to end this. Mason clasped the deputy's shoulder, a silent thank you between men who understood duty. Then he clipped on the headlamp from his pack and began the descent into darkness, Ranger following close behind. The metal rungs were cold beneath his hands, the shaft narrower than he'd expected. The beam from his headlamp revealed smooth concrete walls descending into blackness. Above, he heard Jack call out, "Police, stop, right there." Then the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Mason quickened his pace, heart pounding. The shaft seemed endless, descending at least 50 feet before opening into a horizontal tunnel. When his boots finally touched solid ground at the bottom, he found himself in a concrete corridor lined with faded warning signs and military stenciling. Project Echo. Authorized personnel only. This was it, the heart of Echo, the secret his father had tried to bury, the technology Meridian Dynamics would kill to possess. Whatever waited at the end of this tunnel would finally answer the questions that had haunted the Winters family for generations. Mason took a deep breath and started forward, Ranger at his side. The tunnel stretched ahead, leading them deeper beneath the Montana earth toward whatever legacy William Reed had left behind. The concrete tunnel stretched ahead, illuminated only by Mason's headlamp. Decades-old electrical conduits lined the ceiling, some torn free and hanging like dead vines. Every 20 feet, faded yellow warning signs repeated the same message: Project Echo, authorized personnel only. The air grew colder the deeper they traveled, carrying the metallic taste of long-sealed spaces. Ranger moved with practiced efficiency, nose working, constantly stopping occasionally to inspect side passages that branched from the main corridor. The dog's military training was evident in his methodical movements, the same careful sweeping pattern he'd used to find IEDs in Fallujah. The sounds from above had faded entirely. Mason checked his phone, no signal. Jack was on his own up there facing Blackwood's men with nothing but a service pistol and badge that likely meant nothing to them. The thought spurred Mason forward. Whatever was down here needed to be worth the deputy's sacrifice. After nearly 5 minutes of steady progress, the tunnel widened into a larger space. Mason's headlamp couldn't penetrate the full darkness, but the beam reflected off metal surfaces ahead. He pulled out a larger flashlight from his pack, and its stronger beam revealed what the narrow passageway had been hiding. A massive circular chamber opened before them, at least 40 feet in diameter. The walls were lined with what looked like computer banks and monitoring equipment from another era. Massive mainframe units with reel-to-reel tape drives and control panels studded with analog dials and switches. Despite decades of abandonment, small status lights still blinked on several units, indicating some form of backup power was still operational. At the center of the room stood what could only be described as a containment chamber, a glass cylinder roughly 7 feet tall, surrounded by monitoring equipment. Inside was not a person or even a recognizable object, but a small metallic capsule suspended in clear liquid. Mason approached cautiously, Ranger at his heel. The capsule gleamed under his flashlight beam, brushed steel with military stenciling on its side. Echo Neural Archive, subject ERN, Eleanor Reed, nurse. His mother's initials. Mason's hand trembled as he wiped condensation from the glass cylinder. What had his parents created down here? What memories or more had they preserved? A control panel adjacent to the chamber still showed signs of life, a small green light blinking steadily. Mason brushed decades of dust from the console, revealing a keyboard and monochrome monitor. When he pressed a key, the screen flickered to life with glowing green text. Project Echo Status Archive active. Authorized user access Reed or. Mason's throat tightened at the sight of his mother's name. He typed it in carefully. Eleanor Reed. The system processed for several seconds before new text appeared. User recognized, voice print required for full access. A small speaker grill beneath the monitor emitted a burst of static. Mason hesitated, then leaned closer. Eleanor, it's Mason, your son. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the monitor displayed new text. Genetic marker recognized, partial access granted, loading legacy transfer protocol. The screen filled with dense text, technical specifications intermingled with medical terminology. Mason scanned the document, his confusion growing with each paragraph. According to the files, Project Echo hadn't simply been designed to record memories. It had evolved into something far more ambitious, a system for preserving human consciousness itself. Neural pattern matrices and synaptic echo preservation weren't just technical jargon. They described a process for capturing the essence of human thought, not just memories, but the patterns that formed personality, emotion, even awareness. The military applications were clear, preserving the expertise of their best strategists, the instincts of their finest soldiers, potentially transferring those attributes to new recruits. But William Reed's notes showed increasing concern as the project progressed. Test subjects report awareness of transfer process. One entry read, Subject C experienced memories that weren't his own. Some form of consciousness bleed through occurring between primary and recipient. Ethical implications beyond original scope. Mason scrolled through page after page of increasingly troubled observations from his father. The final entry was dated just weeks before William's disappearance. IE believes we can control the process limit transfer to specific knowledge sets. Military oversight disagrees they want full pattern transfer capabilities. I've removed critical components from main system and relocated them. Without the primary neural transference module, Echo is just an expensive recording device. Better that than what they want to create. A noise from the tunnel entrance snapped Mason back to the present. Ranger's ears pricked forward, his body tensing beside Mason. Voices echoed down the corridor. Blackwood's men had found the well entrance. Mason quickly scanned the room for exits. His father's map had shown multiple access points to the facility. There had to be another way out. On the far side of the chamber, a heavy steel door marked secondary access stood partially ajar. Their escape route if they could reach it in time. But Mason couldn't leave yet. Whatever was in that capsule, his mother's memories, perhaps something more, he couldn't let it fall into Meridian's hands. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for some kind of extraction protocol. The footsteps in the tunnel grew louder. Mason's search grew more desperate until he found what he was looking for: emergency containment transfer. Following the prompts, he initiated the sequence. The liquid in the cylinder began to drain, lowering the capsule toward a small compartment at the base. A mechanical arm inside the chamber detached the capsule from its suspension and rotated it toward an access port. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, a small drawer extended from beneath the control panel. The capsule nestled within. Mason grabbed it just as the first beams of flashlights appeared at the tunnel entrance. It was heavier than it looked, about the size of a thermos, but solid metal with a seamless design. No obvious way to open it, no external controls, just military stenciling with his mother's initials and a serial number. Clutching the capsule, Mason signaled Ranger toward the exit door. They slipped through just as voices filled the main chamber. Through the gap in the door, Mason caught a glimpse of Victor Blackwood entering the room, flanked by men with tactical gear and weapons that certainly weren't civilian grade. What happened? Victor's voice was sharp with frustration. The younger man beside him gestured to the empty cylinder. Container's been accessed, sir. Looks like a remote transfer protocol. Someone beat us to it. Blackwood's curse echoed through the chamber. Find them, now. Whatever they took is government property. Mason eased the door closed, wincing at even the slight sound it made. The secondary tunnel was narrower than the main access, clearly designed as maintenance or emergency exit rather than primary use. His headlamp revealed a steep incline ahead, metal rungs embedded in the wall leading upward. An escape ladder. Ranger would have difficulty with the ladder, but the dog had navigated worse obstacles in combat zones. Mason secured the capsule in his backpack and began the ascent, pausing every few rungs to make sure Ranger was managing the climb behind him. The shaft seemed to go on forever, the air growing noticeably colder as they ascended. Mason's arms burned with the effort, each metal rung slick with condensation. Finally, his hand hit solid resistance, a hatch of some kind. He pushed against it, but it didn't budge. Bracing himself on the ladder, Mason put his shoulder into it. The hatch groaned but held fast. Decades of forest growth had sealed it shut. He pushed again, harder, feeling something give slightly. One more effort, and the hatch broke free, showering him with dirt and vegetation as it swung upward. Fresh air rushed down the shaft. Mason pulled himself out, then reached down to help Ranger make the final climb. They emerged into twilight, the sun setting beyond the mountains. The exit hatch had been camouflaged beneath a fallen tree, its location invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Mason oriented himself based on the position of the sun. They were on the far side of the ridge from his mother's cabin, perhaps a mile from where they had entered. Distant shouts carried through the trees, Blackwood's men spreading out to search the area. There was no sign of Deputy Reynolds. Mason could only hope the man had made it to safety, but the gunfire he'd heard didn't leave much room for optimism. They needed to get back to Martha's cabin, to Ethan. If Blackwood was willing to shoot a law enforcement officer, he wouldn't hesitate to use an 8-year-old boy as leverage. They moved through the forest as quickly as they dared, Mason choosing a route that balanced speed with stealth. The weight of the capsule pressed against his back, a physical reminder of the stakes. Whatever his mother had preserved in that container, it was important enough for her to protect it until her death. Important enough for his father to disappear rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. As darkness settled over the mountains, navigation became increasingly difficult. Mason relied on Ranger's superior senses and his own military training. The distant sounds of search parties faded, then disappeared entirely. Either they had given up the hunt for the night, or more likely they had regrouped to check other potential escape routes. After nearly 2 hours of steady hiking, lights appeared through the trees, Martha's cabin windows glowing warmly against the mountain night. No vehicles outside except Martha's old pickup. A good sign, but Mason approached cautiously nonetheless. Ranger moved ahead, checking the perimeter before giving a soft whine that Mason recognized as the all clear. Martha opened the door before he could knock, rifle in hand. The elderly woman's face relaxed at the sight of him. Thank God. We were starting to worry. Inside, Ethan launched himself at Mason, small arms wrapping tight around his waist. You came back, I knew you would. Mason embraced his son, the simple human contact grounding him after the surreal discoveries underground. Is everything okay here? Martha secured the door behind them, checking the lock twice. No visitors, if that's what you're asking. But Jack called about an hour ago. He's at the county hospital. Said to tell you he took a round in the shoulder, but he'll live. Relief washed over Mason. The deputy had survived. One less weight on his conscience. Where's his backup? The rest of the sheriff's department? Martha's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Davies is looking into the situation. Said Jack wasn't authorized to be on your property, that he was acting outside jurisdiction. Basically hung him out to dry. Blackwood's influence, just as Martha had warned. They couldn't count on official help. Mason carefully removed the capsule from his backpack and placed it on the kitchen table. The metal gleamed under the cabin lights, the military stenciling stark against its brushed surface. What is it? Ethan crept closer, curiosity overriding caution. Mason exchanged glances with Martha. I think it's a part of Grandma Eleanor. The recordings my father mentioned, her memories, maybe more. Martha examined the capsule without touching it. Eleanor mentioned something like this years ago. Said if anything happened to her, the most important parts would be preserved. I thought she was being metaphorical, talking about photographs, letters. She traced the stenciled initials with her finger hovering just above the surface. Never imagined it was anything like this. Can we talk to her? Athens' question hung in the air, innocent but profound. I don't know, buddy. Mason ruffled his son's hair gently. The system in the facility seemed designed to access whatever's stored in here, but I couldn't exactly bring the whole setup with me. As if in response to his words, the capsule emitted a soft hum. A hairline seam appeared around its midsection, illuminated by a faint blue glow from within. Martha stepped back, eyes wide. What's it doing? Mason shook his head, equally bewildered. I don't know. I didn't activate anything. The hum intensified and the blue glow brightened. Then, without warning, the small radio on Martha's kitchen counter crackled to life. Static filled the room for several seconds before resolving into a voice, female, distorted, but recognizable. Mason. The single word hung in the air. Mason felt the hair rise on his arms. He knew that voice. Mom. More static than if you're hearing this, then the archive survived. You've done what your father couldn't. Ethan clutched Mason's hand, eyes wide with wonder and fear. Is that Grandma? Mason could only nod, his throat too tight for words. The capsule pulsed with blue light in rhythm with the voice from the radio. The signal is still active. The voice continued, breaking occasionally into bursts of static. They will do anything to control it. You must finish what we started. It isn't just about memories, Mason. It's something more. Something they'll use if they get it. Martha sank into a chair, her face pale. The technological implications overwhelmed her medical training, decades old as it was. This shouldn't be possible. The radio fell silent for a moment, then the voice returned, softer now. I'm sorry we kept this from you. We thought we were protecting you. But some burdens pass whether we want them to or not. The capsule's glow faded and the radio returned to static. Mason reached out and turned it off, the sudden silence deafening. Ethan broke it first. Was that really Grandma? How can she talk if she's... His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Mason pulled his son close. I don't know exactly, but remember how I explained that computers can store information? Pictures, words, music. His father's technical notes suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. I think this is something like that. Grandma and Grandpa figured out how to store pieces of people, memories, maybe even parts of what makes them who they are. Martha had recovered enough to pour herself a generous measure of whiskey. She drained half the glass before speaking. Eleanor always said William was ahead of his time, just never realized how far ahead. A sudden knock at the door froze them all. Ranger was on his feet instantly, a low growl building in his chest. Mason motioned Ethan behind him and reached for the rifle Martha had left propped by the door. Martha moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. She relaxed slightly. It's Jack's deputy friend Anderson, I think his name is. Mason kept the rifle ready as Martha opened the door. The young deputy on the porch looked harried, his uniform rumpled and hat missing. Ma'am, Mason, the sheriff sent me to check on you folks, make sure everything's all right. The lie was transparent, but Mason played along. We're fine, just turning in for the night. The deputy's eyes darted around nervously. He clearly wasn't comfortable with whatever he'd been sent to do. That's good to hear. Sheriff also wanted me to ask if you've seen any unusual activity around your property. Trespassers, unfamiliar vehicles, that sort of thing. Martha crossed her arms. You mean besides the men who shot Jack Reynolds and chased Mason through the woods? Those kind of trespassers? The deputy flushed. I'm just following orders, ma'am. Mason decided to push. Who's really asking Deputy Sheriff Davies or someone from Meridian Dynamics? The younger man's face confirmed it without words. The sheriff has jurisdiction here, he said without conviction. If there's been criminal activity, it's his responsibility to investigate. And Jack getting shot, it is the sheriff investigating that too. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Look, I just came to make sure you folks were safe. Now I've done that. He tipped his hat and backed toward his patrol car. Have a good evening. As soon as the deputy's taillights disappeared down the road, Martha locked the door and drew the curtains. He'll report straight back to Blackwood. We need to move. Mason nodded grimly. Even with the capsule in their possession, they weren't safe. Blackwood had too many resources, too many connections. We can head for Jack's place in town. He'll know how to contact federal authorities, FBI, maybe military police. Someone outside Blackwood's influence. Martha began gathering supplies, food first aid kit, extra ammunition for her rifle. You'll never make it to town tonight. Roads will be watched. Best to wait for morning leave at first light. Mason hesitated, weighing the risks. Staying meant potentially being cornered if Blackwood decided to move against them directly. Leaving meant traveling through mountain roads in darkness with his son. Ethan settled the debate with unexpected authority. Dad, Grandma said they were coming. We need to go now. Mason looked at his son, struck by the boy's certainty. You're right, buddy. Martha is there a back route into town. Something less obvious than the main road. The old woman nodded, already pulling on her coat. Old logging road runs behind the property. Joins up with County Route 16 about 5 miles east. Hardly used these days. 20 minutes later, they were packed into Martha's pickup, the capsule secured in Mason's backpack. Ranger sat in the bed of the truck, his preferred position, where he could see in all directions. They followed a barely visible track through the tree's headlights off, guided only by the moonlight filtering through the canopy. The old truck protested the rough terrain, suspension groaning over every rut and rock. Ethan clutched the door handle, eyes wide, but excited by the adventure. It's like a spy movie. Mason managed a smile despite his tension. Kind of buddy, except in movies the good guys always win in the end. The boy's expression turned solemn. We're the good guys, right, Dad? The question pierced through Mason's military pragmatism. In war zones, he'd learned how arbitrary such distinctions could be. But for his son, he needed a simpler truth. Yeah, we're the good guys. We're trying to protect something important, just like Grandma and Grandpa did. The logging road eventually widened its surface, becoming marginally more navigable. Martha turned on the parking lights, not enough to be spotted from a distance, but sufficient to avoid the worst obstacles. We're about a mile from the county road, she said. Once we hit pavement, it's another 20 minutes to town. Mason nodded, scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. The weight of the capsule pressed against his back, a constant reminder of what they were protecting. Not just a piece of technology, but potentially a piece of his mother herself. The thought both comforted and disturbed him. Ethan had dozed off his head, resting against Mason's arm. The boy's face in sleep was a perfect blend of Mason and Diane, her nose, his stubborn chin. Another legacy to protect. Without warning, the capsule in Mason's backpack began to hum again. The sound was different this time, urgent, almost alarmed. Before Mason could react, the truck's radio switched on by itself, crackling with static. "They're coming." The voice, his mother's voice, was clearer now, less distorted. "You need to move faster." Martha nearly drove off the road in shock. "Sweet Jesus," the radio continued, Eleanor's voice now interspersed with bursts of digital noise. "They've activated the secondary relay tower. The signal is growing stronger. If they complete the network activation, they'll be able to locate any echo technology within 50 miles. Mason's military training ticked in. How do we stop it? The transmission tower on Pine Ridge. It's the primary amplifier for this region. Without it, they can't establish a strong enough signal. The radio cut out as abruptly as it had activated. The capsule's humming subsided to a barely perceptible vibration. Martha stared at the radio as if it might bite her. "I don't care what scientific explanation there is for that," she said finally. "That's the creepiest damn thing I've ever experienced." Mason couldn't disagree, but his mind was already mapping their next move. Pine Ridge was visible from most points in the valley, a rocky outcrop where the Forestry Service had placed a fire observation tower decades ago. Later, communication companies had added cellular and radio equipment. If his mother was right, somewhere on that ridge was the key to disrupting Blackwood's plans. But first they needed to reach safety, to alert authorities who might actually help them, assuming such people existed, to get Ethan somewhere secure. The road ahead suddenly illuminated with harsh light. A vehicle sat blocking the intersection with the county road, its high beams aimed directly at them. Two more appeared from side roads, boxing them in. Martha slammed on the brakes. Son of a Mason didn't waste breath on curses. He reached for the rifle behind the seat. "Get down, both of you, as flat as you can get," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "Mason Winters, we know you have government property in your possession. Surrender it now, and no one needs to get hurt." Ranger was already in motion, leaping from the truck bed into the surrounding forest. The dog would circle around approach from an unexpected direction, tactics they'd perfected in combat zones. Martha reached beneath her seat and pulled out a revolver that looked older than she was. "My Herbert service weapon from Korea. Still works just fine." Ethan had awakened at the commotion, his eyes wide with fear. Dad Mason squeezed his son's shoulder reassuringly. "It's gonna be okay, buddy. I need you to stay down and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, his face pale but determined. Through the glare of headlights, Mason could make out several figures taking positions around their vehicles. Not just Blackwood's private security, there were sheriff's department uniforms among them. The corruption ran deeper than they'd realized. The megaphone crackled again. "Last chance, Winters. Send out the echo device, and you can all drive away. Make this difficult, and there will be consequences." Mason recognized the voice now, Victor Blackwood himself. He weighed their options. The truck offered minimal cover. They were outgunned and outmanned. Even with Ranger's assistance and Martha's surprising arsenal, a firefight would only end one way. Unless they had a distraction. The capsule in his backpack had begun humming again, more intensely now. Mason removed it carefully, studying its seamless surface. His mother had created this, had somehow imprinted herself, her memories, perhaps her consciousness into this object. Had she also built in protections? When he was 10, his mother had taught him about electromagnetic pulses, how they could disrupt electronic systems. She'd demonstrated with a small device she'd built killing power to his video game system. "Everything electronic has a weakness, Mason," she'd said. "Remember that if you ever needed to disappear." A lesson he hadn't understood the significance of until now. "I need to try something," he whispered to Martha. "When I give the word, floor it, straight through their blockade." Martha's eyes widened, but she nodded grimly, hands tightening on the steering wheel. Mason closed his eyes, focusing on the capsule's vibrations beneath his fingers. If any part of his mother's consciousness remained within, he hoped it would respond. "Mom, if you're in there, we need help. We need a distraction." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the capsule's hum changed pitch, rising steadily until it was almost painful to hear. The blue glow intensified, seeping through the metal seams that shouldn't have existed. Outside, one of Blackwood's men shouted in alarm. The headlights of all three vehicles began to flicker erratically. The megaphone emitted a screech of feedback, then died. In the sudden dimming of light, Mason saw electrical arcs dancing across the vehicle's hoods, an electromagnetic surge emanating from the capsule. Now Mason shouted. Martha slammed her foot on the accelerator. The old truck lurched forward, engine roaring. The men in their path scattered as 3 tons of Detroit steel barreled toward them. They sideswiped one sheriff's vehicle, the impact jarring, but not enough to stop their momentum. Mason looked back to see total chaos, the vehicle's electrical systems completely fried, men shouting in confusion as their radios and flashlights failed simultaneously. In the commotion, a blur of motion caught his eye, rangers circling back through the trees to follow them. Martha took the turn onto the county road hard enough to throw them against the doors but kept control of the truck. The headlights were out, casualties of the electromagnetic pulse, but the old mechanical engine kept running. They drove in darkness, guided only by moonlight on pavement and Martha's lifetime knowledge of these roads. That was one hell of a trick, Martha shouted over the engine's roar. Your mother's full of surprises even now. Ethan had risen from his protective crouch, eyes wide with excitement and lingering fear. Dad did. Grandma do that from inside the metal thing? Mason stared at the now dormant capsule in his hands. I think so, buddy. I think she's still protecting us in her own way. The county road wound through the mountains like a black ribbon, each curve potentially hiding danger. Mason kept watch for pursuit, but the electromagnetic pulse seemed to have bought them precious time. Without functioning vehicles, Blackwood's men would be delayed at least temporarily. As they rounded a bend, the lights of the small town appeared in the valley below, a cluster of brightness in the vast darkness. Mason allowed himself a moment of hope. If they could reach Deputy Reynolds in the hospital, convince him to contact federal authorities, they might have a chance. That hope died as they crested the next hill. A roadblock stretched across the highway, not just sheriff's vehicles, but military-style transports, with the Meridian Dynamics logo emblazoned on their sides. Blackwood had anticipated their escape route and deployed his reserves. Martha slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a skidding halt 100 yards from the blockade. We can't go back, she said, eyes darting to the rearview mirror, and we can't go forward. Mason scanned their surroundings. The county road hugged the mountainside here with a steep drop on one side and dense forest on the other. There was a fire road about a quarter-mile back, barely maintained, but it would take them up toward Pine Ridge. The transmission tower. Mason's decision crystallized. Mom said destroying that tower would disrupt their network. Without it, they can't track the echo technology. Martha looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Even if we could get up there, what then? That tower's government property, probably guarded. It's our only option, Mason cut in. They've blocked the road to town. They've compromised the sheriff's department. We need to buy time for Jack to get federal help. Ethan's small voice broke into their debate. Dad, the metal thing is doing it again. The capsule had indeed begun to hum once more, its blue glow pulsing rhythmically. This time it was the truck's old dashboard radio that crackled to life, a radio that hadn't worked in years, according to Martha. Mason. The voice was clearer now, almost as if Eleanor were sitting beside them. The tower must be shut down. It's not just about tracking the capsule. If they complete the network activation, they'll access the full Echo archive, including the transfer protocols. And what does that mean? Mason demanded, desperation edging his voice. It means they could potentially extract and transfer stored consciousness patterns, apply them to living subjects. The military application your father feared most. The voice broke into static, then returned. The tower has a fail-safe. Your father built it in when he installed the relay equipment. An emergency shutdown protocol. How do I trigger it? The capsule's base contains an activation key. When connected to the tower's primary circuit, it will initiate a controlled burnout of the relay system. The implications were staggering. His father, supposedly dead for over 20 years, had anticipated this moment, had built in protections that only family would know how to access. Martha had already turned the truck around, heading back toward the fire road turnoff. The old vehicle groaned as she pushed it harder than it was meant to go, but the mechanical beast responded admirably. They found the fire road easily enough, a narrow dirt track switching back up the mountainside. The truck lurched and bounced over ruts and exposed roots, its suspension protesting every foot of the ascent. Ethan braced himself against the dashboard, equal parts terrified and thrilled. Is Ranger okay? Mason checked the side mirrors, scanning the darkness behind them. Don't worry about him. He's following our trail. He'll find us. The boy nodded, accepting his father's assurance with complete faith. It struck Mason how much trust Ethan placed in him. Trust he wasn't entirely sure he deserved, given the danger he'd led them into. The fire road eventually plateaued near the ridge's summit. Through the trees ahead, they could see the transmission tower, a skeletal metal structure silhouetted against the night sky, red warning lights blinking from its apex. A small control building sat at its base, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Martha killed the engine and coasted to a stop, concealing the truck among the trees. No vehicles visible near the tower, but that doesn't mean it's unguarded. Mason studied the facility through a small pair of binoculars from his pack. No obvious security personnel, but a keypad access on the fence gate suggested some level of protection. He examined the capsule again, focusing on its base. A small seam had appeared where none existed before revealing what looked like a data port of some kind. The radio crackled one last time. Be careful, Mason. Once the failsafe activates, you'll have 3 minutes to clear the area. The electromagnetic pulse will be substantially stronger than what you've already witnessed. The implications were clear. Anything electronic within range would be fried beyond recovery, including potentially the capsule itself. Ethan looked from Mason to the capsule with dawning understanding. Does that mean Grandma will go away? Mason didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like a lie. I don't know, buddy, but I think she knows the risk. And she's still trying to help us. A soft whine from the darkness announced Ranger's arrival. The dog emerged from the trees panting but unharmed. His military training had served him well once again, allowing him to follow them undetected through hostile territory. Martha checked her revolver one final time. I'll stay with Ethan. You do what needs doing. Mason nodded, grateful for the old woman's steady presence. He knelt before Ethan, hands on the boy's shoulders. I need you to stay with Martha. Okay, no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, you stay with her until I come back. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded bravely. Promise you'll come back. The question cut deeper than any wound Mason had sustained in combat. He pulled his son into a fierce embrace. I promise. Nothing could keep me from coming back to you. With Ranger at his side, Mason moved through the trees toward the transmission tower. The facility appeared deserted, but he maintained caution, approaching from the side with the least visibility from the access road. The perimeter fence was standard government-issued chain link with barbed wire topping, designed to keep out casual intruders, not determined ones. Using wire cutters from his pack, Mason created an opening large enough for him and Ranger to slip through. The control building's door featured another keypad lock, but to Mason's surprise, it was ajar. Someone had already been here recently. The interior was cramped, but organized walls lined with equipment, racks, and monitoring stations. Most of the technology looked decades old, but newer components had been integrated alongside the original systems. Meridian had been upgrading the facility, preparing it for whatever purpose Blackwood intended. At the center of the room stood a primary control console, its screens displaying real-time signal metrics from the tower above. One monitor showed a map of the region with 3 points illuminated this tower, and 2 others forming a triangulation pattern. The network Eleanor had warned about was nearly operational. Mason examined the console, looking for anything that might accept the connection port on the capsule. The technology was a bizarre hybrid of Era's vacuum tubes alongside modern processors, analog dials beside digital readouts. His father's design philosophy seemed evident in the redundant systems and mechanical backups for electronic components. A panel near the base of the console caught his attention, newer than the surrounding equipment, with the Meridian Dynamics logo embossed on its surface. When Mason pried it open, he found a socket that appeared to match the port on the capsule. Ranger growled suddenly, ears perked toward the door. Mason froze, listening. Vehicles approaching, the distinctive sound of heavy SUVs on the unpaved fire road. Blackwood had figured out their destination. Mason worked quickly now, all caution abandoned for speed. He removed the capsule from his pack and examined its base. The seam had widened further, revealing not just a connection port, but a small keypad. Input required, but what his mother's voice echoed in memory. Everything has a password, Mason, something meaningful, something you'll remember but others wouldn't guess. What would Eleanor have used? Her birthday has some military service number. Mason tried several combinations without success. The vehicles were getting closer, perhaps 2 minutes away. Then it hit him, the photo from the wooden box Martha had given him. His parents standing before a military installation. Project Echo, 1974. The beginning. Mason entered the date 07041974. Independence Day, 1974. The keypad glowed green and the base of the capsule rotated a quarter turn, fully exposing the connection port. Mason aligned it with the socket in the console and pressed it home. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the console came to life, screens filling with cascading code. A mechanical voice announced, "Fail-safe protocol initiated. Electromagnetic pulse charging. Detonation in 3 minutes." A countdown appeared on the main screen, 3:02, 59, 258. Mason grabbed the capsule and bolted for the door. Ranger racing ahead. As they emerged from the building, headlights swept the facility entrance. 3 vehicles crashing through the gate without bothering to open it. Men poured out, weapons drawn. Among them stood Victor Blackwood, his expensive suit exchanged for tactical gear. Mason Winters. "Stop right there," Mason and Ranger darted behind the building, using it as cover. The countdown was already under 2:30, not enough time to reach Martha and Ethan, but they needed to put distance between themselves and the tower. A bullet pinged off the metal wall, inches from Mason's head. He ran in a zigzag pattern toward the tree line, Ranger keeping pace beside him. More shots followed, but the darkness and their movement made them difficult targets. Mason risked a glance back. Men were rushing into the control building, too late to stop the failsafe, but not too late to be caught in its effects. Blackwood remained outside shouting orders as his team tried to abort the sequence. The tree line was still 30 yards away when Mason heard a new sound, a helicopter approaching from the east, its spotlight sweeping the ridge. Meridian's resources apparently extended to air support. Mason and Ranger reached the cover of the forest just as the spotlight found them. The brightness was blinding after the darkness, leaving Mason momentarily disoriented. He stumbled forward, one hand shielding his eyes, the other clutching the capsule. A figure stepped into his path, not one of Blackwood's men, but an older individual in military dress. The man's face was weathered but familiar in a way that stopped Mason cold. "Hello, son." Mason's breath caught in his throat. The man before him could have been looking in a mirror at his future self, same jawline, same eyes, only aged by decades. Even Ranger seemed confused, whining softly as he sniffed the air. Dad, William Reed nodded, once his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come looking. You've stirred up something that can't be contained now." Mason's mind reeled with questions, but the countdown ticking in his head left no time. "You're alive all this time." A small, sad smile crossed William's face. "Not exactly. What's left of me is complicated. But we need to move. Now." The failsafe is about to trigger. As if on cue, the capsule in Mason's hand began to vibrate violently, its blue glow intensifying to painful brightness. Through the trees, the transmission tower had begun to emit an eerie hum that rose in pitch with each passing second. William grabbed Mason's arm with surprising strength for a man his age. "They've modified the system. The pulse will be stronger than I designed it. We need more distance." They ran through the forest, William setting a pace that belied his years. Ranger kept close, occasionally looking back at the newcomer with canine confusion. Blackwood's voice echoed through the trees behind them. "Reed, we had an agreement." William didn't slow. Over his shoulder to Mason, "I've been monitoring their operation for years, playing along, feeding them just enough to keep them from looking elsewhere. But they found Eleanor's capsule anyway." The capsule, Mason suddenly remembered. Mom's inside it somehow. If the EMP. She knew the risk. William cut him off. "She's the one who insisted on the failsafe in the first place." They reached the clearing where Martha's truck was hidden. Ethan spotted them first, his eyes widening at the sight of the stranger accompanying his father. "Dad." "Who's no time?" Mason shouted, "Everyone down. Cover your ears." Martha pulled Ethan to the ground behind the truck. Mason and William joined them, Ranger huddling close. The capsule's vibration had become a high-pitched whine that set their teeth on edge. The night exploded into brilliance. A wave of blue energy erupted from the transmission tower, expanding outward in a perfect circle. The helicopter that had been sweeping the area suddenly dropped like a stone, its electronics instantly fried. In the distance, secondary explosions marked the deaths of vehicles and equipment caught in the pulse's radius. The shockwave hit them a moment later, not physical, but electromagnetic, washing over them, with a sensation like static electricity multiplied 1,000-fold. Mason felt his hair stand on end, smelled the sharp ozone tang in the air. Then silence, complete and absolute. When Mason dared to look up, the transmission tower was a blackened skeleton against the night sky, thin wisps of smoke curling from its structure. The capsule in his hand had gone dark and cold, its surface now dull and lifeless. Ethan emerged from cover first, his natural resilience asserting itself. His eyes locked on William, widening with recognition, despite never having seen the man before. Grandpa William's weathered face softened as he looked at his grandson for the first time. The resemblance is strong in this one. Mason stood shakily, mind still struggling to process his father's presence. "You've been alive all this time." Hiding his voice cracked with decades of accumulated hurt. "Why didn't you come back for us?" William's eyes held a sadness too deep for words. "Because what came back wasn't entirely me." He tapped his temple with one finger. Echo didn't just record Mason. It created echoes of consciousness copies that could exist independently of their original hosts. Some of us volunteered to test the long-term stability of the transfers. Martha had joined them now, her expression oscillating between shock and scientific curiosity. "So you're what a copy A ghost in the machine?" William smiled faintly. "Something like that." Eleanor found a way to stabilize the neural imprint, make it self-contained. When the original body died, the echo remained. He looked at Mason directly. "I didn't abandon you, son, but what I became couldn't be a father, not in any normal sense." In the distance, shouts and the sounds of confused movement indicated that Blackwood's surviving men were regrouping. The EMP had neutralized their electronics, but they still had manpower and conventional weapons. "We need to move," William said urgently. "The fail-safe bought us time, but Meridian has resources beyond what you've seen." This facility was just one node in their network. Mason looked down at the now inert capsule in his hands. "Is she gone?" My mother William's expression softened further. "Not gone, dormant. The containment system is designed to protect itself by shutting down during an electromagnetic event. She'll reactivate when it's safe." He glanced toward the forest where the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. "But we need to get her to somewhere secure first." Martha had already started the truck, its old mechanical engine unaffected by the electromagnetic pulse. "I hate to break up the family reunion, but if we're leaving, it needs to be now." Mason hesitated, looking at his father, or whatever version of William Reed now stood before him. "Are you coming with us?" William shook his head. "I need to make sure Blackwood doesn't salvage anything from the facility. There are still components that could be dangerous in the wrong hands." He placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, the gesture awkward but sincere. "Take your son and go. Deputy Reynolds knows people who can help people outside Blackwood's influence. Tell him to contact Colonel Sarah McKenzie at Pentagon Special Projects Division. Tell her Echo has evolved. She'll understand." Before Mason could protest, William turned to Ethan and knelt to the boy's level. "You take care of your dad, okay? He needs someone to remind him that not all battles have to be fought alone." Ethan nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by throwing his arms around his grandfather's neck. The older man stiffened momentarily, then returned the embrace with visible emotion. The moment was shattered by gunfire from the direction of the transmission facility. Mason bundled Ethan into the truck, Ranger leaping into the bed behind them. William was already moving toward the sounds of pursuit, his posture transforming into something more tactical, more purposeful. "Dad," Mason called after him. William paused, looking back one last time. "She was right about you, you know. Eleanor always said you'd be the one to finish what we started, to make it right." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I'm proud of you, son. Always have been." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Martha gunned the engine and the truck lurched forward, beginning the treacherous descent down the fire road. Mason clutched the capsule to his chest, its weight a tangible reminder of what had been lost and perhaps what might still be saved. As they drove away from Pine Ridge, the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. A new day was breaking over the mountains of Montana, a day that would bring fresh dangers, but also the first real answers Mason had found in a lifetime of questions. The family legacy he'd been running from had finally caught up with him. Now he had to ensure it didn't consume his son as well. The old truck groaned down the mountain headlights, unnecessary in the growing dawn. Martha gripped the wheel with white knuckles, navigating the treacherous fire road by instinct and memory. In the passenger seat, Mason cradled the dormant capsule, its once gleaming surface now dull and lifeless. Ethan had finally succumbed to exhaustion, his small body curled against Mason's side, head resting on his father's leg. In the truck bed, Ranger kept vigilant, watch ears perked for any sign of pursuit. They had escaped the immediate danger of Blackwood's men, but Mason harbored no illusions about their safety. Meridian Dynamics had resources far beyond what they'd witnessed, connections in places that should have offered protection. The EMP had bought them time, nothing more. Williams' words echoed in Mason's mind. Deputy Reynolds knows people who can help. Jack Reynolds was still in the county hospital with a bullet wound, hardly in position to mobilize federal assistance, but he was their only hope of reaching someone beyond Blackwood's influence. When the fire road finally connected with paved highway, Martha released a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. 20 miles to the hospital. With luck, we'll make it before anyone organizes roadblocks. Mason nodded grimly. Luck had been in short supply lately, but they had little choice but to push forward. The highway stretched empty before them, the earliest commuters not yet on their way to jobs in town. Martha kept the speedometer hovering just below the limit, fast enough to make progress, not so fast as to attract attention. As civilization gradually reappeared, scattered farms, then clustered houses at the edge of town, Mason's tension ratcheted higher. Every parked sheriff's vehicle, every black SUV represented potential threat. But no one moved to intercept them, and Martha guided the truck through quiet streets to the county hospital's rear entrance. The small medical center was just waking up for the day shift. A few nurses changing over, an ambulance crew restocking their rig. No one paid particular attention to the dust-covered pickup or its exhausted occupants. Mason gently shook Ethan awake, tucking the capsule securely in his backpack before they entered. Finding Jack's room proved simple. Small hospitals held few secrets. The deputy lay propped in bed, left arm heavily bandaged, face drawn with pain, but eyes alert. His expression shifted from surprise to relief when they entered. Didn't expect to see you folks so soon. Figured you'd be halfway to Canada by now. Mason quickly explained what had happened at Pine Ridge, the EMP Williams' unexpected appearance, the message for Colonel Sarah Mackenzie. With each revelation, Jack's expression grew more serious. Your father's alive. After all these years, the deputy shook his head in disbelief. And he thinks this Pentagon colonel can help Mason place the inactive capsule on the bedside table. She's our only option. Blackwood's reach extends through local law enforcement, possibly state level too. We need someone with federal authority military connections. Jack nodded slowly, wincing as he reached for the phone. I've got a buddy from Army CID Criminal Investigation Division. Not Pentagon brass, but he might know how to reach your Colonel Mackenzie. While Jack made his calls, Ethan explored the small hospital room with childish curiosity, examining medical equipment with careful fingers. Martha had stationed herself by the door, the revolver concealed, but accessible in her oversized purse. Ranger lay beneath the window, apparently dozing, but ears moving with every new sound. Jack's expression brightened as his call finally connected. His side of the conversation consisted mostly of terse military jargon and references to old operations, but his final words sent hope surging through Mason's chest. My CID contact says Mackenzie's team will be here by noon. Military transport authorized federal intervention. They're classifying this as recovery of sensitive national security assets. The relief was palpable, but Mason's military experience kept his optimism tempered. 6 hours. Blackwood would regroup long before then. We need somewhere to lie low until they arrive. Jack pondered a moment. Hospital basement has an old fallout shelter, civil defense relic from the Cold War. Maintenance uses it for storage now, but nobody goes down there much. Security code is 5193. A knock at the door froze everyone in place. Martha's hand disappeared into her purse. Ranger rose silently to his feet. A nurse's voice called through doctor's rounds. In 5 minutes, Deputy Reynolds. Mason made a swift decision. We'll head for the shelter. Jack, you haven't seen us. If anyone asks, you've been sleeping since your pain meds at dawn. Jack nodded, then gestured Mason closer. Whatever that thing is, he whispered, glancing at the capsule, it scared some very powerful people. Be careful. They slipped from the room during shift change chaos, following service corridors to the basement stairs. The hospital's lower level was a maze of pipes, electrical panels, and storage areas. Ancient signs with faded radiation symbols eventually led them to a heavy metal door with a keypad lock. The fallout shelter beyond was exactly as Jack had described, a large concrete room repurposed for hospital storage. Dusty boxes of outdated equipment lined metal shelving units, while one corner held mountains of old patient records. A small bathroom facility showed signs of occasional use, and ancient emergency lighting still functioned on backup power. Martha immediately took charge, her nursing background surfacing as she assessed their situation. She organized a makeshift sleeping area for Ethan using discarded cushions from broken waiting room furniture, then inventoried their remaining supplies. The boy, remarkably resilient, was already exploring the shelter's perimeter, ranger padding faithfully alongside. Mason found a relatively clear space and set the capsule on an empty shelf, studying its dormant surface. According to William, Eleanor's consciousness, or some digitized echo of it, remained intact inside, temporarily shut down by the electromagnetic pulse. But how to reactivate it, and more importantly, should he? The ethical implications were staggering. If the capsule truly contained some version of his mother's consciousness, did he have the right to keep it dormant or to reactivate it? The technology had been designed for military purposes, preserving the knowledge and skills of elite soldiers. But his parents had clearly evolved it far beyond its original scope. Mason's contemplation was interrupted by Ethan's excited voice. "Dad, look what I found behind a stack of storage containers." The boy had discovered an ancient ham radio setup, likely part of the shelter's original emergency communications equipment. Despite decades of disuse, the analog system appeared largely intact. "Think it still works?" Ethan's fingers hovered over dusty dials, eager to experiment. Mason examined the equipment with growing interest. Most analog radio systems had been unaffected by the electromagnetic pulse, their simpler electronics more resistant than modern digital technology. If operational, the radio might provide a means of monitoring outside communications, perhaps even contacting Colonel Mackenzie's team directly. While Mason worked to revive the old radio, Martha organized their meager rations. Ethan eventually succumbed again to exhaustion, curling up in the makeshift bed with Ranger as his pillow. The German Shepherd remained alert despite his own fatigue, positioning himself to watch both Ethan and the shelter's entrance. After nearly an hour of tinkering, Mason managed to coax life from the radio. Static filled the small shelter as he carefully tuned through frequencies, pausing on local emergency channels. The chatter confirmed his fears. Blackwood had indeed regrouped. Police bands buzzed with reports of a domestic terrorist incident at the Pine Ridge Communication Facility, with descriptions of Mason, Ethan, and Martha broadcast to all units. "They've turned the entire scenario around," Mason muttered. "Now we're the criminals, not them." Martha's laugh held no humor. "Not surprising. Men like Blackwood own the narrative. Power lets them rewrite reality." As morning stretched toward noon, the radio brought increasingly concerning news. Roadblocks had been established on all major highways out of the county. The FBI had allegedly been called in, though Mason suspected this was Blackwood's men masquerading as federal agents. Most worrying, hospital security had been enhanced due to credible threats. Blackwood's people were in the building. Mason switched frequencies, scanning for any sign of military communications that might indicate Mackenzie's approaching team. Instead, he found only civilian chatter and increasingly urgent police coordination. Martha voiced what they were all thinking. "They know we're still in town. They're narrowing the search grid." Mason nodded grimly. Even if Mackenzie's team arrived as promised, they might find nothing but bodies if Blackwood located them first. The capsule suddenly hummed to life. The sound, barely perceptible at first, gradually intensified. Blue light seeped through invisible seams in the metal surface, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Mason approached cautiously, remembering the electromagnetic surge it had generated at Pine Ridge. Martha pulled Ethan behind her protectively. "Is it going to?" The ham radio crackled, cutting through static with crystal clarity. "Mason," Eleanor's voice. Stronger than before, more defined. The capsule's glow stabilized, neither growing nor diminishing in intensity. Mason approached the radio hesitantly. "Mom, you're back. The secondary systems are recharging. I've established connection through compatible analog technology." Her voice sounded almost normal now, though occasionally fragmented by static. "They're in the hospital," Mason, searching floor by floor. "You have approximately 28 minutes before they reach the basement level." Ethan had awakened at the commotion, eyes wide as he recognized his grandmother's voice. "Grandma, can you see us?" A pause then. "Not exactly, Ethan, but I'm aware of you. The capsule houses sensors, primitive by current standards but functional. The radio facilitates vocal communication." Mason cut through the technical explanation. "Mom, we're trapped. Blackwood's men are blocking every exit. Colonel Mackenzie's team won't arrive for hours." Another pause longer this time. "Through the basement northwest corner, there's a maintenance tunnel. Original hospital blueprints show it connecting to the town's old storm drainage system. Abandoned in 1983, but still structurally intact." Mason exchanged glances with Martha. "How would you know about hospital blueprints?" Eleanor's voice, carried a hint of amusement. "William and I planned for contingencies. Echo technology required extensive preparation." Martha was already moving toward the northwest corner, pushing aside storage containers to reveal a rusted metal door nearly invisible against the concrete wall. The ancient hinges protested when Mason forced it open, revealing a narrow utility tunnel stretching into darkness. The capsule's glow brightened momentarily. "I can guide you through the tunnel network. The drainage system emerges half a mile north of town. If you can reach it before Blackwood secures the area, you might intercept Colonel Mackenzie's team on the North Highway." It was their only option. Mason quickly packed their remaining supplies while Martha helped Ethan into his jacket. The boy insisted on carrying the radio himself, clutching it like a lifeline to the grandmother he'd never met in life. The capsule presented a greater challenge. Its intermittent electromagnetic properties made it potentially dangerous in confined spaces, particularly if it generated another pulse. Yet they couldn't leave it behind. Not only was it their primary objective to protect, but it now represented their only reliable guide through the underground maze. Mason wrapped the capsule in layers of cloth from his pack, hoping to muffle any electromagnetic emissions. The blue glow remained visible, even through the improvised shielding, a constant reminder of the extraordinary technology they carried. The maintenance tunnel was barely 5 feet high, forcing Mason and Martha to hunch uncomfortably as they moved. Ethan, small enough to walk upright, took point with the radio, relaying Eleanor's directions at each junction. Ranger brought up the rear, occasionally whining at the confined space, but never faltering in his protective duty. They had progressed perhaps a quarter mile when distant sounds echoed through the tunnel behind them. Voices, flashlight beams, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Blackwood's men had found the fallout shelter sooner than expected. "Move faster," Eleanor's voice urged through the radio static. "Take the next left turn, then immediate right." The tunnel network grew more complex as they moved deeper beneath the town. What had begun as a single maintenance passage expanded into a labyrinth of drainage channels, utility corridors, and forgotten civil defense structures. Without Eleanor's guidance, they would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. Water began to appear underfoot, first in occasional puddles, then as a constant, shallow flow. The storm drainage system, their destination, was near. Ethan struggled to keep the radio dry, holding it above the rising water level as they waded forward. The drainage tunnel, when they reached it, was mercifully larger, 8 feet in diameter, with a raised maintenance walkway along one side. Ancient fluorescent fixtures, most long dead, provided sporadic illumination. The air was damp and musty, but fresher than the maintenance tunnels, suggesting access points to the surface nearby. Eleanor directed them northward, following the drainage channel's gentle decline toward its eventual outlet beyond town limits. According to her calculations, they would emerge approximately half a mile south of where Colonel Mackenzie's team should establish their perimeter. Their progress slowed as fatigue set in. Ethan, despite his determination, couldn't maintain the earlier pace. Ranger limped slightly, his injured leg bothering him more with each passing hour. Even Martha, tough as Montana pine, showed signs of exhaustion. The radio crackled again, Eleanor's voice now tinged with urgency. "You need to move faster. Blackwood has deployed thermal imaging drones over the northern sector. Once you're above ground, you'll be exposed." Mason fought rising frustration. "We're moving as fast as we can. Ethan's exhausted. We're all running on empty." A long pause. Then Eleanor's voice returned, softer now. "I understand, Mason. The burden I've placed on you, that William and I placed on you, it isn't fair. It never was. We thought we were protecting you by keeping you away from Project Echo. Instead, we just delayed the inevitable." The raw emotion in the digitized voice silenced Mason's complaints. For all the technological miracles involved in Eleanor's preservation, the most remarkable aspect was how fundamentally human she remained. Not just memories or patterns, but the essence of his mother, her compassion, her determination, her capacity for regret. Light appeared ahead, natural daylight, filtering through a grated outlet. They had reached the drainage system's northern terminus, exactly where Eleanor had predicted. Mason approached cautiously, peering through the rusted bars at the landscape beyond. The drainage channel emptied into a small creek bed surrounded by scrubby pine forest. No buildings visible, no signs of surveillance, just Montana wilderness stretching toward distant mountains. According to Eleanor's calculations, they were approximately 4 miles north of town, well beyond the hospital security perimeter. The grate secured by decades-old bolts yielded to Mason's multi-tool after several minutes of effort. They emerged into crisp afternoon air, the November sun already tracking toward early winter sunset. Mason checked his watch, 3:14 p.m. If Colonel Mackenzie's team had deployed as scheduled, they should already be in the area. Martha squinted at the horizon, orienting herself with practiced ease. North Highway's about a mile east, she said, pointing toward a break in the tree line. If we cut through those woods, we should intersect it near the old Miners Creek Bridge. Eleanor's voice crackled through the radio again. Satellite imagery shows 3 military vehicles approaching from the south. Convoy formation consistent with Special Operations Protocol. ETA to Miners Creek, approximately 17 minutes. Mason stared at the radio in surprise. You have access to satellite imagery? Another of those pauses then. The Echo network extends further than Blackwood realizes. William built redundancies into the system, isolated nodes that wouldn't be affected by localized disruptions. The implications were staggering. Project Echo wasn't just a military experiment gone rogue, it was an intelligence network with capabilities rivaling national security agencies. No wonder Meridian was so determined to acquire it. They set off through the forest, moving as quickly as their exhausted bodies would allow. Ethan had found his second wind energized by the fresh air and open space after hours in the tunnels. Ranger 2 seemed rejuvenated, trotting ahead to scout their path. When they finally reached the highway, they positioned themselves near the bridge where they'd be visible to approaching vehicles without exposing themselves to potential civilian traffic. Mason checked the capsule, still active, its blue glow steady through the fabric wrapping. The distant rumble of engines announced the convoy's approach. 3 unmarked black Humvees moving in tight formation, no military markings, but unmistakably government issue. Mason stepped onto the roadside, one hand raised in the universal signal for assistance. The lead vehicle slowed, then stopped. Military precision was evident in how the other vehicles positioned themselves, one blocking the road behind, one angled to provide cover. Armed personnel emerged with practiced efficiency weapons not quite pointed at Mason's group, but ready to engage if necessary. A woman in her late 50s exited the lead vehicle. Her civilian clothes couldn't disguise her military bearing, and the deference shown by the tactical team confirmed her authority. She approached Mason directly, eyes sharp and evaluating. Mason Winters, William Reed's son. Her voice was clipped professional. I'm Colonel Sarah Mackenzie, Pentagon Special Projects Division. Deputy Reynolds' contact said you have information about Project Echo. Mason indicated the capsule in his pack. More than information, Colonel. I have Echo itself, or at least a critical component. Mackenzie's composure slipped momentarily, genuine surprise, registering before her professional mask returned. Inside that container is active Echo technology operational. In answer, Eleanor's voice emerged from the radio. Ethan still clutched. Hello, Sarah. It's been a long time. The colonel's reaction was immediate and profound. She stepped back, hand instinctively moving toward the sidearm beneath her jacket. Eleanor, that's not possible. You died 3 years ago. Not entirely, Eleanor's voice replied. William's modifications to the Echo architecture proved more successful than either of us anticipated. The neural preservation protocols evolved beyond our original parameters. Mackenzie recovered quickly, military discipline reasserting itself. She gestured toward the lead Humvee. We need to move this conversation somewhere secure. Meridian has assets throughout the county, including aerial surveillance. They loaded quickly into the vehicles, Ranger initially hesitant until Mason coaxed him aboard. The convoy executed a practice turnaround and headed south, but not toward town, instead taking a forestry service road that circumvented population centers. Inside the lead Humvee, Mackenzie continued her interrogation focus, alternating between Mason and the radio through which Eleanor communicated. How much of the Echo network remains operational? Are there other preservation capsules? Did William survive the decommissioning? Mason answered what he could, explaining their encounters at the underground facility and the Pine Ridge transmission tower. Ethan, overtaxed by the day's events, had fallen asleep against Martha's shoulder, still clutching the radio. The old woman watched the military personnel with wary eyes, her hand never far from her purse where the ancient revolver resided. 40 minutes of rough travel brought them to a clearing where a military transport helicopter waited, rotors already spinning in preparation for immediate departure. Mackenzie's team moved with practiced efficiency, transferring Mason's group and their equipment without wasted motion. As they lifted off, Mason caught his first comprehensive aerial view of the situation. Multiple roadblocks circled the small-town vehicles with Meridian Dynamics markings interspersed with Sheriff's Department cruisers. Near Pine Ridge, smoke still rose from the remains of the transmission facility. Most concerning, a convoy of heavily armed personnel was tracking northward following their tunnel route with methodical precision. "We're evacuating you to Fort Harrison in Helena," Mackenzie explained over the helicopter's noise. "It's the nearest secure military facility with appropriate containment capabilities for Echo technology." Mason frowned. Containment? The colonel's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes shifted. "Project Echo was classified top secret for a reason, Mr. Winters. The technology your parents developed has national security implications beyond what you've witnessed. Our primary objective is securing it before Meridian or other unauthorized parties can weaponize it." The clinical detachment in her voice triggered alarm bells in Mason's military-trained mind. He'd heard similar tones from officers preparing to make difficult decisions where individual lives were secondary to mission parameters. Securing it or securing her? Mason nodded toward the radio where his mother's consciousness resided. "Because they are not separate entities anymore, Colonel. Whatever Echo was designed to be, it's evolved into something more." Mackenzie's expression hardened slightly. "That assessment remains to be determined by appropriate scientific authorities. The technology will be handled according to established protocols for experimental military assets." Established protocols. The phrase landed like a physical blow. Mason recognized the bureaucratic evasion, the same language used to justify everything from enhanced interrogation to experimental weapons testing. The colonel wasn't viewing the capsule as containing a person's consciousness, but as a piece of technology to be studied, perhaps dismantled. Eleanor's voice crackled through the radio, surprisingly calm given the implications. "The preservation protocols cannot be reversed or extracted, Sarah." William ensured that Echo subjects would have autonomy, including the right to terminate their digital existence if necessary. Mackenzie leaned forward, interest sharpening her features. "Are you saying the consciousness inside the capsule can self-terminate?" "Not just terminate," Eleanor's voice corrected. "If threatened, the preservation matrix will initiate a cascading deletion that renders all Echo architecture permanently inoperable." William called it the dead man's switch, a final protection against weaponization. The revelation clearly unsettled Mackenzie. Her mission parameters had just shifted dramatically from recovery of military technology to negotiation with a sentient digital entity capable of destroying that same technology. "What do you want?" The colonel's question was direct, professional. "All preservation subjects must have objectives." "What's yours, Eleanor?" The radio fell silent for several moments. When Eleanor's voice returned, it carried a weight beyond the digital distortion. "To protect my family. To finish what William and I started. To ensure Echo technology is never weaponized by any side." Mackenzie's laugh held no humor. Noble sentiments, but hardly specific parameters. "The Pentagon won't release classified military technology based on vague ethical concerns." Mason interrupted, patience exhausted. "We're not asking for permission, Colonel. My mother's consciousness is not government property. Neither is my son's safety or mine." He leaned forward, at voice dropping. "My father is still out there. He's monitored Meridian's operations for years. If anything happens to us or to this capsule, he has contingency plans that will expose everything Project Echo Meridian's illegal operations, the Pentagon's involvement in covering it all up." The bluff was calculated but necessary. Mason had no idea if William had such contingencies in place, but the possibility alone might force Mackenzie to reconsider her approach. Before the colonel could respond, the helicopter pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Unidentified aircraft approaching from northeast, Colonel. Military profile, no transponder." Mackenzie moved to the cockpit with practiced urgency. Through the helicopter's windows, Mason glimpsed a sleek black aircraft rapidly closing distance. Not military standard issue, but something more advanced, more specialized. Meridian Mackenzie confirmed returning to the cabin. Their resources exceed what we anticipated. She addressed her team with calm efficiency. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Priority is protecting the Echo technology. Mason corrected her firmly. Priority is protecting my son. The colonel's expression softened fractionally as she glanced at Ethan still sleeping despite the escalating situation. She nodded once. My team will ensure civilian safety, but we cannot allow Echo to fall into Meridian's hands. The implications would be catastrophic. The pilot banked sharply as the pursuing aircraft closed distance, forcing everyone to grab for handholds. Ranger whined anxiously, pressing closer to Ethan's side. Martha, pale but composed, kept one protective arm around the sleeping boy. Eleanor's voice emerged from the radio again, artificially calm amid the chaos. There's an alternative neither of you has considered. The capsule's blue glow intensified visible, even through its protective wrapping. Project Echo was never intended as weapon or intelligence asset. William and I designed it to preserve human wisdom and experience across generations, a digital legacy immune to mortality's limitations. Another sharp evasive maneuver threw them against their restraints. Through the windows, Mason glimpsed the pursuing aircraft matching their movements with uncanny precision, almost as if it anticipated their pilot's decisions. They're targeting our systems, the pilot called back. Electromagnetic interference affecting navigation and communications. Eleanor's voice cut through the growing tension. I can disrupt their targeting systems, but it will require redirecting power from my preservation matrix. The consequences are uncertain. Mason understood immediately. She was offering to sacrifice herself or at least risk her digital existence to protect them. The decision twisted in his chest, an impossible weight. Would he lose his mother a second time? Ethan had awakened amid the chaos, eyes wide with fear, but remarkably free of panic. The boy clutched the radio tighter, as if physical contact might somehow protect the consciousness within. Grandma? No, there has to be another way. Eleanor's voice softened. Sweet boy, sometimes protection requires sacrifice. It's what family does, what your father has always understood. The pursuing aircraft had closed to firing range weapon systems visibly deploying beneath its wings. Mackenzie barked orders to her team, preparing for the worst-case scenario, but her tactics seemed inadequate against Meridian's advanced technology. Mason made his decision. Mom, if you do this, will you still exist afterward? The capsule pulsed brighter. The core consciousness should remain intact, but access capabilities may be permanently compromised. In simpler terms, I'll still be here, but may not be able to communicate as I am now. For the first time since discovering Project Echo, Mason felt clarity. His parents had created something extraordinary, not the weapon the military had envisioned, but a bridge across mortality itself. A way for wisdom and love to transcend physical existence. He placed his hand on the capsule, feeling its warmth through the protective wrapping. Do it. The capsule's glow intensified until it was painful to look at directly. Blue light filled the helicopter cabin, casting everyone in ethereal illumination. The radio emitted a high-pitched tone that made Ranger howl in distress. Then Eleanor's voice clearer than it had ever been. I love you, Mason. I love you, Ethan. Find your father. Finish what we started. Energy surged from the capsule in a visible wave passing through the helicopter's metal skin without resistance. The pursuing aircraft's sleek form suddenly faltered its engines, sputtering as systems failed. It peeled away, dropping altitude rapidly, but maintaining enough control to avoid catastrophic failure. In the sudden quiet that followed, Mason looked down at the capsule. The blue glow had dimmed to a faint pulse, barely visible, even in the helicopter's shadowed interior. The radio had gone silent. No static, no voice, only absence where Eleanor's presence had been. Ethan's small hand covered Mason's on the capsule's surface. Is Grandma gone? Mason shook his head slowly. Not gone, just quieter now. She's still in there, buddy. She saved us. Mackenzie watched the exchange with unreadable eyes. Your mother's sacrifice has implications beyond this immediate situation, Mr. Winters. The Echo technology remains classified. The Pentagon will want answers containment control. Mason met her gaze steadily. Then they'll have to negotiate with my family, not just your command structure. Echo isn't just technology anymore, Colonel. It's people. My mother, possibly my father. They made their choices and will honor them. Ethan's voice rose with unexpected strength. Grandma said to find Grandpa and finish what they started. That's what we're going to do. The simple certainty in the boy's statement silenced the adults. Mason looked at his son with new understanding. Ethan had accepted the extraordinary reality of his digital grandmother, the continued existence of a grandfather he'd never physically met, with the adaptability unique to children. Where Mason saw complications and ethical dilemmas, Ethan saw only family extended in unusual ways, but family nonetheless. As the helicopter continued toward Fort Harrison, Mason's thoughts turned to William. His father was still out there monitoring, protecting, waiting. A man who had sacrificed his normal existence to ensure the technology he helped create wouldn't be weaponized. A man who had watched his son from afar for decades, unable to reach out without risking everything. We'll find him, Mason promised silently. And whatever Project Echo was meant to become, we'll help it get there. Not as a weapon, not as an intelligence asset, but as the legacy you and Mom envisioned. The capsule pulsed once beneath his hand, as if acknowledging his unspoken commitment. Fort Harrison appeared on the horizon, its military precision a stark contrast to the wilderness surrounding it. Whatever happened next, debriefings, negotiations, scientific examination of the capsule, Mason knew their journey was far from over. Blackwood and Meridian remained threats. The military establishment represented by Mackenzie had its own agenda for echo technology, and William was still out there carrying his own version of the digital legacy Eleanor had preserved. But for the first time since returning to his mother's cabin, Mason felt something beyond fear and confusion. Purpose, understanding. The weight of legacy, yes, but also its power and promise. As the helicopter began its descent toward the military base, Mason held his son close with one arm, the capsule secure in his other hand. Ranger pressed against their legs. Martha's weathered hand rested on Mason's shoulder, and the presence of Eleanor diminished but enduring pulsed gently within the metal container. Family. Expanded beyond conventional boundaries, tested by extraordinary circumstances, but family nonetheless. And in that moment, despite all they had endured and all that awaited them, Mason knew they would face it together, the living and the echoes united by bonds that even death and digital transformation couldn't sever. The legacy of Echo had only begun to unfold.